Today we're talking about extremism because it's been on my mind, as it often is. It seems like we're moving toward a time where we maybe cannot find a place of reconciliation. Maybe we can't find a place of middle ground. Maybe moderation in our society isn't going to be possible at a certain point. It's sort of like if you throw the laundry into the washing machine and you start it going, and you can tell it's starting to get off balance. It's not extremely off balance yet, but the more faster it spins, the more it starts to slam around, and after a while, you have the washing machine walking around the room because the spinner is so off balance, you know, it could actually damage the machine at that point or damage its surroundings. And that's what we see happening in our society as polarization increasingly becomes the norm. I've leaned to the left, I've leaned to the right, and ultimately the more I've lived, I've reached the conclusion that the correct place to be is actually in the middle. A pretty independent position. The issue is people don't really like the middle. The middle doesn't get things done. The middle isn't exciting. The middle doesn't generate clickbait. And so we have a society where you either have to pick the left or you have to pick the right. And so maybe we vote against the incumbent in elections. Maybe that's what we do. You know, that's fine. You could do that. But it doesn't change the fact that quite often neither side is really right. They both have systemic problems. But people start to really attack each other, and they start to view themselves as part of a specific camp, a community, if you will. And I think community is a word that is used more than perhaps at any other time in our history. Everything is a community. If you're a fan of a particular video game, you go online and participate in that community's Reddit. If you are a member of a particular political party, then that party has a community. Everyone has a community for everything that they're a fan of. And then sub-communities within those. And sometimes that's nice because it brings people together around shared interests. But the risk is, instead of us having a big common interest as a whole, we identify ourselves by aligning with a specific splinter. And then we view everything outside of that silo as other, as enemies, as opposition. So what happens? What happens when we continue to go through this cycle? We go through a democratic administration. There's certain things that we don't like, probably for justifiable reasons. We feel that the administration is not run very well. We feel that we are marginalized in some particular way. We're concerned about certain things. So we vote for someone else, right? Maybe it's just that power tends to corrupt over time. So you kind of want to vote out the people who are starting to be in power for too long. But every time the pendulum swings back and forth, it swings further. People think that whoever's on the other side is the enemy. So they treat the opposition in a way which is disrespectful, which is more inclined to marginalize people who have differences. And so the people who are on the other side have two options. They can ally themselves with people who hate them, or they can entrench themselves more deeply in the position which will, even if it is flawed and extreme, give them a place and a seat at the table. For example, let's just say that I voted for Donald Trump, which I did. And I do not apologize for doing that, because the reason I voted for Republicans is because of systemic problems with my experience and observation of activist liberalism. And without going too deeply into it, for example, we had a time when, during the peak of the pandemic hysteria, we were so obsessed with things like masks and vaccination that stores were putting up checkpoints at the front door to check to see what people's vaccination status was. In Walmart stores in Canada, very briefly, if you were not vaccinated for COVID-19, you could not walk into a major big box store and buy groceries to eat. We had gotten so extreme in that particular moment in time that we would punish people for not having a vaccination. And there were folks on the left who were saying things along the lines of implying that if someone wasn't vaccinated for COVID, they shouldn't even be allowed to be part of society. That's how extreme things were beginning to get. We had the trucker blockade, where Canadian truck drivers weren't able to cross the border into the United States if they could not prove their vaccination status. And those kinds of things definitely proved that the activist left, unhinged, will take away people's liberties. On social media platforms like Facebook, we saw any voice of dissent, anything that undermined the left narrative. We saw people shut down, banned, removed, deplatformed, punished for having opinions which didn't align with the dominant narrative of the moment. We saw gender politics elevated to a level of the ludicrous, where instead of advocating for the rights of women as equals and embracing gender equality, we started to go down the path of trans activism, suggesting that it might be inappropriate to even acknowledge the existence of women as a distinct gender. So if you said something about women, that was implied as a bigoted thing in certain circles. We moved away from the idea of sexualizing women so far that portraying women as feminine rather than portraying characters in, for example, video games as gender neutral was seen as some sort of a extreme thing. I'm sure I could go on. We could look at the rioting which happened following the events of the George Floyd killing. And while it is certainly reasonable to say that police force can be abused, and racism is not a thing that does not exist, the narrative surrounding that also drifted deeply into the territory of extremism, because people started to say that a figure like George Floyd was somehow at the level of, for example, Martin Luther King, that he was a martyr who deserved adoration. And the reality was that he was a man who was deeply flawed, perhaps a man who did not deserve to be brutalized at the hands of law enforcement, and yet also a man who himself had engaged often in acts of violence himself, domestic violence against women. So you see, these are real things. We saw people in the name of progressive activism destroying downtown areas, burning things, throwing bricks, smashing out the windows of department stores because they felt they were entitled to something. We watched people in Seattle destroy an entire police precinct while that lawless behavior was portrayed as a, quote, summer of love. And it was very difficult in the events following January 6, when admittedly boisterous protesters caused some damage in Washington, D.C. following Donald Trump's election loss. It was very hard to compare what happened on January 6 to what had happened during the Black Lives Matter protests and riots, because we saw downtown areas pillaged. I saw the footage of entire Walmart stores basically destroyed to the point they had to be rebuilt after significant periods of closure. And it was all done. The looting, all of it was done in the name of political, race-based activism, which, even if it's rooted in certain elements of valid concerns, it was wrong. And leadership in our country at that time chose to turn a blind eye to lawlessness and to have a heavy-handed approach toward people on the right who opposed them, while being sympathetic to extreme elements on the left. All of those kinds of things were unhinged. They were wrong, and they were frightening, because what we saw was liberalism devolve from moderate liberalism into activist liberalism. We saw a lot of people have the attitude that social media platforms, large corporations could work lockstep with the government to censor opinions which were deemed to be unpopular. And the left proved that it had no problem engaging in witch hunts, and it would use its authority to the fullest extent to demonize anyone that disagreed. And so, it turned out, all of those behaviors alienated a lot of voters between 2020 and 2024. And so Donald Trump won an election. And I voted for him because of same reasons why many other people who probably would lean toward voting as moderate liberals felt like it was time for a change. Cue the Donald Trump second administration. Here we are. And we see the activist left essentially treated like it's a thing of the past and washed away along with all traces of progressivism. And now the new administration is doing exactly what the liberals wanted to do, just in a form of retribution, basically. Chasing political enemies, silencing opposition, brutalizing people if it has the ability to make a spectacle of those which it deems to be others. We see people being criminalized wrongfully. We see minorities being put in fear of illegal treatment at the hands of things like ICE. We see minorities being marginalized. We see due process being blatantly ignored as things like the White House ballroom plan move forward. We see Donald Trump becoming a cult of personality as all of the people who followed him religiously become emboldened. And all of the people who had a vendetta against the left continue to rally together to create a snowball of hatred toward the left. A hatred which is matched by the people on the other side too. So, if you are a person who aligns with the right, but does not subscribe to the idea of a Trump cult of personality, well, the right will not embrace you because you're not extreme enough. If you're on the left, but you aren't a person who always supports the left lockstep without condition, well, then you're a sellout, you're a traitor, you're dumb, you're ignorant, you are one of the others. You see, the left wants people who will worship activist liberalism. The right wants people who will worship some sort of far-right extremism. And people who choose to stand in the middle, voting against incumbents, and finding objection to the abuse of power, whether it comes from the left or the right. Those people will not have a place at any table. Unfortunately, that's becoming a pendulum that swings harder and harder to the left and the right. We swing to the right, there's problems, so we vote against it. We swing further to the left, there's problems, we vote against it. We swing even further to the right. Every time there's a swing, there's more momentum behind it. So you see, I can say that we need to stand against the problems we see in the current administration. And I do believe that. But here's the fundamental underlying problem. We're going to see the pendulum swing. There will probably be a blue wave when it comes to the 2026 midterms and the 2028 general election. Donald Trump will become a thing of the past. All of the MAGA stuff will go away. And we will swing to the left, as we have many times before. But what is going to happen after that? The left is again going to become excessively empowered, excessively emboldened, and still operating in a deep, hate-filled silo. So, we will swing further to the left than we swung last time. Until once again we're looking at a liberal administration abusing its power egregiously in some way for some reason. And we're going to say we have to take a stand against it, again, voting out incumbents and swinging back to the right. And every time it happens, we get closer to a society which views itself as entitled to absolute power for its specific interest group. There comes a time when, whether it's the left or the right, absolute despotism becomes a permanent way of life. because the pendulum swings so far in one direction that it doesn't come back. And that is how a liberal democratic republic perishes and fades off the face of the earth. You see, we have been a bit of a aberration in history. We have been a largely moderate and progressive society. And despite certain problems, we've moved more in the right direction than the wrong one. We have done a lot of good in the world as we have migrated one painful step at a time from the caves toward the stars. It has been probably one of the most blessed and peaceful times in human history. But that's not an assurance for the future. And we certainly do see a lot of cracks and fissures appearing, which are exacerbated by the ability to chase likes. The internet has created a problem. Because when you go online and you can potentially get likes for saying what people want you to say, then instead of sharing your mind honestly, you're more likely to share an opinion which is popular. People start to get in the habit of generating content which aligns with what their viewership would like to see. Because after all, if you have a choice that you can get hundreds of upvotes on Reddit, or you could get hundreds of downvotes, what are you going to choose? You're going to choose the content which reinforces you and builds you up, instead of the content which potentially will make you feel more poorly about yourself. So those silos will continue to get deeper and stronger, and the walls will become more unpenetrable. That is where we are going. Now, if you get people off the internet and into environments where they have to engage with each other directly, face to face, a lot of that goes away. Because the truth is that we have more which binds us together than there is which pushes us apart. Even if I criticize things that happen on the left or things that happen on the right, that does not mean that I am opposed to people on one side or the other of the aisle. I have a lot in common with Republicans, and I have a lot in common with Democrats. And I reserve the right to vote for either side. But that is not a rubber stamp of unconditional approval, which is not something I'm willing to reappraise and question. And I think that leads me to another thing which must be talked about here. It's very important that you are willing to reevaluate your position on everything in life. I was raised as a Christian, but there was a point when I had to look at life, look at where I was at, and look at the facts. And a lot of the things that I believed in, I had to face the reality that they were probably not true. So my life changed because my views changed and evolved with time. That wasn't a convenient thing. It required giving up a lot of preconceptions. It required being willing to walk away from a lot of things which could have been comfortable in favor of things which were true, as far as I can tell. It meant being willing to not be part of a community, because I would rather be a student of the truth than a member of a community. These are not easy things. And it's also not easy to change your position when you know you're going to be hated by both sides for it. Because, for example, I can say that I support liberalism because to some degree I'm a moderate liberal. But as someone who doesn't rubber stamp everything on the left, it's inevitable that the people who define themselves as left-leaning will view me as a sellout. So it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter if I vote the way the left wants next election. I'm not part of that community because they don't care if you vote their way one election. Doesn't change the fact you're dumb and stupid for not voting with them every election. And same deal. Doesn't matter if I'm a Trump voter in 2024. If I decide I want to vote for a Democrat in 2028, well, you can watch all of those Republicans point out how dumb and stupid and undeserving of respect I am. That's just how it works. And yet, it's important and healthy to evaluate your position and be willing to change it. Does that mean that you're going to have to face life alone many times? Yes, it does. That's part of being a grown-up. You make a position based on the facts you have in front of you, based off of your faculties and your judgment. And usually that's going to mean that you are alone. And guess what? That's normal. We want to live in a society where we get constant validation all the time. And the reason for that is in part because of the way people are always on social media looking for upvotes and likes and all of that stuff. Now, I've left some social media platforms like Facebook. I think it's a great idea to walk away from. Now, platforms like Reddit, well, I do have objections to them. But I also think that there's something to be said for the fact that you get value out of being online. And if you get rid of every single thing that may be problematic in some ways, eventually you're left with nothing. And so what it comes down to is you kind of have to say, well, there's problems with everything to a point, but I'm not going to just go off into the woods and disappear off the face of the map and not talk to anybody and not, look at the internet anymore and just, act like everything that can be toxic is something I'm dead to. So yeah, I'll be online to a point, but I also have to be aware, self-aware, that there's a limit to how much I'm willing to maybe spend time in certain circles. I have to be objective enough to understand that you're going to be exposed to silos which don't necessarily reflect a healthy perspective in certain ways. And so don't take everything personally. I think that that's an important lesson to learn in life. If you don't take everything personally, then it's both you don't seek attention, you don't seek approval, and you also don't necessarily take it personally if you are denied approval from others. As for what happens next, what the future of the world is going to look like, I don't know. It certainly looks concerning, though. It's concerning because it seems like we continually drift toward bigger disparities, imbalances, problems, where you can't get away from extremism because it's not as simple as saying, well, you know, the far right is extreme, so I'll just, you know, go to the left. Well, the left is extreme too. And when somebody doesn't have the authority to do something, then they will be more meek. But as soon as they get the power and they're holding all the cards, then again, they become like that abusive person in a relationship. You know, it's kind of like how women can be extremely manipulative in a relationship, and they will act like they're a victim when really they're instigating things. That's not all the time, by no measure, but it can happen. Women can be treacherous and evil, and guys can also be control freaks. They can also be extremely malicious and toxic. You see, like, both genders are very different, but both of them are capable of harming others, and neither of them are innocent when you have relationships, because maybe the methods and the tone and texture and the issues are different, but human character is the same. No matter what your politics is, what your background is, what your gender is, people can do harmful things. And there is no silo you can put yourself in where you're going to be completely safe from it. That's just life. What we should do is try to be voices of moderation in a perhaps imbalanced and extremist society. We can be thoughtful instead of putting ourselves in a silo. And maybe we won't be the most dominant position because moderation isn't vogue, but we can do our best to speak the truth as advocates for what is right. And maybe it doesn't mean we're in the majority, but we can still do it. We can still try to be free thinkers in a world where people just pick something and then align with it. So there's that. The final thing I would mention is just that when it comes to what we do with our lives, what we do in terms of our field of work, there is a certain moderating force in being part of something which naturally brings people together. For example, I work for Walmart, and is Walmart a perfect company? No, it's not. Is it capable of having toxic, cruel people in it? Yeah, absolutely. But by and large, I have a lot of respect for the company, because in a world which is often divided, I know that what we are working to do is something that brings people together. It doesn't matter if you're a right-leaning person or a left-leaning person, young or old. It doesn't matter who you are. You would probably like to be able to go to the store and get comparatively affordable groceries in a safe, clean, accessible environment. It's not a political business. No matter how much you can try to project some sort of political agenda onto it, it really is pretty neutral. And it appeals to people on both sides of the aisle, people from every spectrum. And there's a lot of things in life we can be part of which prioritize service over polarization. You could go volunteer at a food bank. I'm pretty sure if somebody doesn't have food to eat, it doesn't matter whether they're a Republican or a Democrat, they probably will be rationally grateful for a bag of food that they could maybe feed their family with. These are the kinds of things which matter. And the more you move away from things like online platforms and more into physical space where you're doing something with real people in a room, you're actually connecting with folks. You're not just online, raging on Reddit. the more you realize, well, yeah, the world has problems. There are issues which are of concern. But that does not mean that there is not good in the world. It doesn't mean that we can't make a positive difference with the lives that we have. And so, you know, for me, I'm more likely to spend some time on LinkedIn and less likely to put my time on something like Facebook. I try to limit some of my exposure to online social media on the platforms I still am active on, like Reddit. It can be useful. You can learn something. You can connect with like-minded individuals, but it can be toxic. So, I try to limit myself on there a little bit and be kind of, conscious about these things. And it's really all about trying to figure out how you can, be a moderate in a world that is often seemingly not moderate, and make real connections with real people, and put yourself in situations where being an asshole does not get you ahead. If you go to work wearing some sort of a political t-shirt and you tell your coworkers that if they didn't vote the way you voted, they're evil, well, you're probably not going to be doing very well in your job. So guess what? You're probably not going to be tempted to do some of those things, unless you're just dimly lit. You're probably going to keep a few of those opinions to yourself. And when you look in the eyes of somebody and you're sitting there at a table with them and you're listening to their perspectives, usually it will start to sink in that they aren't actually very different from you. Yes, their perspectives may be different, but that doesn't mean that they are on a different team in the game of life. When you realize that, then, well, you're more likely to serve side by side with people who possibly vote in a way that is different than the way you would vote at a general election. If there's one thing we can do that's going to be a positive thing in our lives, in our society, for our nation, is to spend more time connecting with others. And that's not just something which matters for the reasons of avoiding polarization. It's also something which is a skill. Because a lot of people who have been part of the digital age their whole lives have a tendency to always avoid real conversations, avoid picking up the phone and talking to somebody, avoid going and doing something that involves real connection. We want text messages, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, all that stuff. That's what we want. We want the easy space where you can ghost somebody without any consequences. You can be cruel to somebody without any ramifications. You can be bold when you should be humble, and you can be absent when you should be accountable. That's what we want. But when you are dealing with real people in the flesh, you're accountable to treat people the way you would want to be treated. And that accountability is something which bears dividends in every part of life, in relationships, in politics, in society, in business, economics, all of it. So learn how to talk to people. Learn how to respect people who are different than you. Learn how to seek out people who are different than you, to embrace the fact that diversity is something which gives us strength. And yeah, sometimes that isn't comfortable, but it's necessary. At the end of the day, I genuinely believe that the best days for our civilization potentially are ahead of us. I am not net cynical, but you can be optimistic about the potential of society while also having deep concerns about whether that optimism is well-founded. And that is where I'm at. We need to work to take down the volume when it comes to expressing attitudes, sentiments of hatred, and sentiments that people who are different than we are somehow the enemy. You can't ask people to join your cause when your attitude is that anyone who hasn't always been part of your team is the enemy. So let's try our best to be rational forces of tolerance, kindness, and respect. And in a world which likes to divide itself, let's always try to end the day with an attitude that I will not allow the sun to go down on my wrath. I will not allow myself to be that person. And I will always seek to do what I wish, but to do no harm to anyone. No matter how different we may think we are, if you could walk in the shoes of someone who you think of as diametrically opposed, you would probably realize that behind all of the lashing out, there's just a real human being who would like to be the recipient of understanding and empathy. So no, sometimes some respectful distance is appropriate, but that does not mean that we should completely shut out people because we think that somehow they have committed an unpardonable transgression by not seeing the world through our personal lens. In any case, as always, best wishes on your adventure. Till next time, thanks so much.